You would do that, wouldn't you? So we're here. What did we get the Madison Court, or we just got the Midnight Justice? Oh, so we have the Midnight Justices. Oh, what was when Jefferson and Madison said that states could nullify federal laws? What was that called? Yeah, those Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. Aaron Burr. Who went against Aaron Burr to help Jefferson win the election? And what did Adams and Adams supporters blame for his loss in 1800? Slave power. What is it? What constitution? What compromise of the Constitution is that? Yeah.
What was it that Jefferson did before, like, he became president?
He was Secretary of State and then Vice President.
Well, no, like, you were talking about it yesterday, right? As the bell rang.
I'm not sure.
He was. How do you know how much?
Oh, I mean Jefferson. Jefferson was still president, vice president. I guess I'm not sure. I can't remember.
What?
He was still at his plantation. Who was the slave that he? Yeah, Sally Hemings. That would become a very nasty campaign issue. What were the laws that legalized rape again? Legalized rape. What an interesting way to put it, but that's what it was. All right, so we got. Did we just literally stop right here?
Yeah.
So Madison. I'm sorry. Madison was going to be Secretary of State. Let's get back to Adams. Would he call it president or elected? Is that where we got the lame duck yesterday? So Adams is lame duck, and the Federalists made a bunch of new federal courtships. In the Constitution, the Congress creates courts, and who appoints judges? So Adams appointed, I put installed, but I should have put appointed, a bunch of new Federalist judges. Here's John Marshall, the most important being John Marshall, who would be the new Chief Justice. How long is a federal judge on the bench? A lifetime appointment. So long after Adams is dead, Marshall's going to be Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He would be or have that office until 1836. In fact, the Federalist Party died before 1820. So the Federalist Party was dead, and they still have Federalist judges on the bench. That's why that presidential duty, the presidential responsibility of appointing judges is such an important position. And despite what seems to be a little chaotic right now in the administration, as I mentioned before, Trump has appointed more judges than any president has in many terms, because they'll be on long after he's gone. So that's a big issue. Yeah.
What is a lame duck again?
They were elected, or I'm sorry, they lost re-election or their term is over, but they're not running again.
Okay.
So there's someone who's not going to be on the bench anymore, called a lame duck. So like Obama was essentially a lame duck right through won his second term because he's not going to run for a third.
How many justices has Trump appointed?
No, he was in the upper 40s just a couple of days ago, but I think it's like 54 now, including one member of the Supreme Court.
So it's just
so that's like all the
all the federal judges and all the appellate courts. It's big. That's really big, and they're almost all young men, relatively young. Yeah.
So how do they appoint new ones without like getting rid of the old ones?
Well, what happens is the court system is so big, there'll be judges there that they've never replaced. And a combination of Republicans not confirming Obama appointees, and they were really pretty slow at appointing ones. They had this backlog. There's always all these judges to appoint because the court system's so big. This is a major, major issue today. Well, you can imagine how angry Jefferson was. He came in, you have all these Federalist judges. And in fact, he ordered his Secretary of State to not seat anymore. And that's going to lead, well, a couple things. First off, the Supreme Court is going to be called the Marshall Court. And the Marshall Court is always named after the Chief Justice. Do you remember who the Chief Justice is now?
Oh, Roberts.
Yeah, John Roberts. It's the Roberts Court now. And the Marshall Court, we call it nationalist. In this context, it means pro-federal government. It's going to give more power to the federal government. And when Madison would not seat the judges, including one Francis Marbury, I always want to call him Stephon Marbury, he used to play basketball for the Minnesota Timberwolves. It's not him, if you're wondering. Marbury sued the Secretary of State. Back when the Secretary of State actually seated the judges, it's not like that anymore. And this court case will be Marbury versus Madison. And it will be the most important court case. There'll be a few court cases we need to know. You know, this is not a government class, or as we said yesterday, government. But in it, he said Madison was acting unconstitutional. And by making that ruling, the Supreme Court gave themselves the power of judicial review. They created a power to check the constitutionality of laws. But remember, it requires a court case. So they don't go looking through laws. It has to be some kind of case brought up. So like I told you before, there are still laws on the books that are unconstitutional, but for whatever reason, it hasn't had that test. Now, Madison originally thought for the Constitution that the president would do that. And then we have the states would nullify laws. By the way, what was the law that Jefferson and Madison hated back in 1798? Say it again. Yeah, those Alien and Sedition Acts. Well, it still wasn't clear for almost a whole century if the federal government or the Supreme Court could check the constitutionality of laws. But there we're done. Done for the year. Let's review for the test. There we go. Jefferson could not believe this. All this power and these unelected people. He wanted to impeach Marshall. They would impeach one judge, who was clearly insane. And Jefferson talked term limits or something to get those judges out of power. And this is going to be an issue to this very day. Should judges be elected? Should there be term limits? And that includes state judges. For example, the state Supreme Court in Montana, they're elected. So you have a partisan election. And, well, it's technically nonpartisan, but it becomes partisan. And where money can make a big difference. And he had a problem here. Heck, Lincoln would threaten to arrest the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court during the Civil War, Roger Taney. So there's been a lot of battles between presidents and the Supreme Court. And who knows, maybe not now, but the Supreme Court right now is a 5-4 majority for those who probably favor what Trump does, but you never know. And then let's jump right to land policy. Land policy, now I didn't write this down. So Jefferson, after the Midnight Judges, so this is going to take a couple years. We'll come back to this Marshall Court. Remember, Jefferson wanted to open land to what kind of people? Yeomen, independent small farmers. He wanted cheap land. He wanted to open up the Wild West of Ohio and Georgia, this area right here. And so that's what he wanted, cheap land. The federal government surveyed land. You remember that land ordinance of 1785? That seems way a long time ago. You get into the test, don't you? Just nod. This is affirmative. I like this map because it's from 1803, and you can still see the survey lines. And those townships, the little grid. I think that's pretty cool how you can see it back when they actually did it there. And the federal government's selling land. But here's the deal. You see that land right here? That comes from a treaty that actually happened back in 1795 called the Treaty of Greenville. And the Treaty of Greenville, this was after the climatic battle of the wars in Ohio called Fallen Timbers. You see this watercolor? This is a dramatic portrait of what probably did not happen. But that guy's flying. This was a victory of the United States over a confederacy of tribes. I'm not talking about this one because there's another confederacy that's even more important, and they're defeating bigger under Tecumseh. But the Treaty of Grenville gave the United States, see all this land kind of darker gray? North of the Ohio River, that's going to be the U.S. all the land north of the Ohio in light gray, that would be land to the various tribes, and the treaty stated for how long. Anybody want to guess how long that would be? Forever. And how long did forever last?
50 years. Not long.
About as long as it took the ink to dry. And the United States began to violate that treaty by people moving into land guaranteed. We'll come back to this. But here's Ohio now. Well, it's going to be Ohio. But they have to make a state. The federal government is one that says whether or not it can become a territory. And so, two laws are going to be very important that I can't. Maybe my battery's going dead. My mouse. The Enabling Act of 1803 and the Land Act of 1804. They'll kind of lay out Jefferson's idea. Because the thing is now, we're going to set up a state, Ohio, and let people buy land there. And also set aside some of that money for public education. Not quite what we think of public education yet. We're not quite there. We need the Industrial Revolution. And then, yeah. It's that tiger up there. And then the Land Act of 1804. Originally, land was going to be sold by one by one mile sections. Now, quarter sections of 160 acres. Who could afford that land now? Who's that? Yeah, the yeoman. So independent farmers, people with less money. So the idea was to set the land out for more people. Two acts to kind of give you an idea about Jefferson's ideal of making the land cheaper. And what would happen is the sale of public land would contribute a significant amount of public revenue and didn't need other taxes, at least for a while. And another kind of interesting thing, first off, they never actually created the state of Ohio. They talked about it. Ohio became a state. They sent senators and members of the House. The Electoral College, they sent electors. But they never actually said that it'd be a state. For over 190 years, technically, Ohio wasn't a state. The law never said they could create the state of Ohio. They just were a state. We've had a lot of presidents from Ohio, and it wasn't yet a state. So it wasn't until the 1990s that they would redress that and actually write into law that Ohio could have become a state in 1803. Technically. So that's just, they made a little mistake in the law. You'd be surprised how many times they make mistakes in laws. And secondly, who's this guy? Johnny Appleseed, yes. He was a real man. He was a Jeffersonian Republican. And he believed the best way for small farmers to survive was a crop they knew would be consistent even if it didn't have a lot of rain. I was waiting for somebody to say, kale. No. Just think about apples. Like corn, what can you make from apples? That could be a value-added product. You can't make whiskey or rum, will you? But apple cider, hard cider. Remember, they drank a lot more back then, a lot more alcohol. You can just drink alcohol. Yeah, just alcohol. Well, and no, he did not wear a tin pan on his head or that kind of thing. Yeah, a real person who was a Jeffersonian Republican. And so, that being his land policy. The problem was for a lot of Republicans. Oh, we've got one more thing. This way. Let's fight a war. Very quickly, the Barbary pirates, and what's coming to, it's going to be called the Tripoli War at the time of the Barbary pirates. There have been pirating in the Mediterranean since as long as there's been humans in the Mediterranean. But these little principalities technically were under the control of the Ottoman Empire, but they were pretty independent, and they have been capturing ships, also imprisoning and enslaving their crew, stealing their products for years. And what most countries did is they just paid them a tribute, a bribe to not stop ships under their flag. Heck, the United States did that back in 1798. Paid a bribe to not have their ships stopped. But in 1801, they demanded another bribe. And Jefferson said, no more. We're going to keep paying bribes. If we keep paying bribes, you ask for more. If it's wrong, we will not bow down to tribute. And what happened was this. They started stopping more American ships. So what did Jefferson do? Have almost no navy. But he sent what little bit of navy we had, us in this room. And what do you call naval infantry? What do we call naval infantry today? Yeah, that's the Marines. We call them Marines, but every ship is going to have somebody, they'd be up in the mast, and they shoot down at other ships that are gunners, they're crewmen during a fight, and they would board the other ship. The Marines were always very small. In the 20th century, because of something called big stick diplomacy, we'll get to it, they would grow. And so he sent the small force there. Oh, I should add this. If you want to have fun today, go walk up to somebody who's in the Marines, especially if they've been in the Marines for a while, and remind them that the Marines are part of the Navy. You're going to have so much fun. You'll make a new friend. Yes.
My dad, which is a retired Marine, and he makes a point to go, those damn Navy people, they're so awful.
Yeah, it's actually, I'll give somebody 3 points extra credit if they do it.
I need more.
And if you come back, oh, they get so mad.
Why is it
They just don't want to come. We're not part of the Navy. We're independent, our own unit. So, we don't have a lot of ships, but fortunately, they're still using old galleys, and they're still using ships that have 50 rowers with tree mares and things like that. And so their navy is for the Mediterranean, so it's not their ships can't be quite as big. This is after the attack on Tripoli, which is now the capital of Libya, and they used a fire ship. Take an old ship, fill it full of oil and a few other things that might burn a lot, maybe a little bit of gunpowder, set it on fire, and they basically just let it loose right into the Barbary pirate ships. It might blow up, but the thing is, wooden ships, they'll catch fire so easily. They got all these, everything that would just burn really quick. So they just panic. It scatters the fleet. And so, not really a war, not really a fight. This is another shot of shelling Tripoli, but it's, at the time they called it the Tripoli War. But what made it so controversial, remember Jefferson bitterly attacked Adams for the undeclared, what was that war that Adams fought? I heard it somewhere. Yeah. Quasi or quasi-war. Both use quasi. Quasi mode. Very good. I like that. And Marines did storm one base, and there was a couple small fights, a couple dramatic affairs. It was a tiny little war. And as actually, I need to drink of water. Take 10 seconds break. So go get up, walk around. Yeah, I remember when I was in school, the teacher would just give me a second, walk over and pop on a cigarette, come back and teach. Ah, the good old days. I'm actually not kidding about that. I remember my first grade teacher with a cigarette in front of class. All right. That was last year. So what happened was this. We ended up pulling out. They kept pirating, and we ended up paying a tribute anyways. Yeah, so it really wasn't for anything, but it shows the reason why this is a big deal. It's a combination of, wow, we went to the Mediterranean with a few ships when we had basically no military, but it shows the complexities of those implied powers, that necessary and proper clause. And so with that, Jefferson going to war without declaration. He kept the Bank of the United States. It appears like he's doing a lot of what the Federalists wanted, and then two roads that I keep on forgetting to move over. That's not the Berlin Road, it's the Cumberland Road. It's also called the National Road. And this was a Cumberland for the Cumberland Gap, which is the pass over the Appalachian Mountains right here. Daniel Boone. This was federally funded, so paid for by the national government. This was a big extension of national power. And now these weren't quite states yet when they first appropriated the money, but then Ohio would become a state. And it would go from Maryland at the end of the Potomac River, over the pass, and then ends up at first Vandalia, but eventually St. Louis. And this is actually, much of the road's a national park now. And so this is the pamphlet for the national park guide. If you get a chance, it is amazing, that road. And I'll tell you why in a second. We just want to say it starts in Maryland. Yeah, eventually we'll go to St. Louis. Yep. Yeah, there are big hunts are still there. Heck, for years, even though it's narrow, think about it, the road's gonna be narrow just enough for 2 wagons to go by. But they used it for cars up until the 1980s. And the road had almost no improvement. It's called the macadamized road. What's that? It's called the macadamized road. After a guy named, he's a Scotsman, macadam, and they invented this across Britain. And what they would do is they would take a flat piece with a slight little angle, and they would flatten it with that rollers pulled by horses. I always want to say steamroller, but it's steam power is brand new. And then they would break rocks. Anybody want to volunteer for this job? Because that's what we're going to do after the AP exam. I finally decided. I'm just going to get a pile of rocks out in the parking lot. We're going to get hammers and we're going to break rocks. And then what will we do when the rocks are all broken? We'll put them back together. Yes. And then we'll go outside with shovels, and I'm going to tell you there's dirt in my hole. I have to get rid of it. There's dirt in my hole out there. Get rid of the dirt in my hole.
What was it called?
How do you get rid of dirt in the hole?
Okay, I think
You
there
dig.
was already a hole, and I was like,
Now you get it? Yeah. I fought the long one. So, I like Bob Marley. All right. So they would break the rocks up into really fine stones. Then they would put them down, and they would get them as even as possible, then roll over them a number of times. And the rocks would compress and form a really hard, not quite concrete, because there's now the cement in there, but those roads have lasted pretty much intact since around 1815. So they're pretty remarkable, but you can imagine this would take forever to make. I've actually helped someone do this in a patio. They made it for their patio back of their house.
you broke rocks.
Well, the rocks were broken.
They just use like concrete, so.
Hmm?
Because concrete's expensive.
Yeah, concrete's a little more expensive. This takes longer, but concrete erodes because the cement will erode. This one doesn't erode the same way if you have the right drainage. The water just goes right through it.
So this is.
But it takes forever to make. That's why they're used for roads now. Yeah.
It's like one versus almost like asphalt.
Well, the Romans had asphalt. The Romans had something like cement, so they actually used some of that. The Romans were amazing. So I just think that's fascinating how they did that. It gives you an idea of we're right on the edge of the steam revolution. So that's kind of the last legacy of the previous time, proto-capitalism to capitalism. But a lot of Republicans were furious at Jefferson, and they called themselves the Quids. And this 12-year-old young woman by the name of John Randolph, who was in his late 30s, remember what I told you about pictures, right? Did I say junior high girl? That's what they draw. They accused Jefferson of being too much like the Federalists, too much like Hamilton. And it shows the thing about the two-party state, or two-party system. Remember, with winner take all, we have two parties. But with two parties, there's going to be a lot of different ideas within that party because it's going to be so big, as we see today within the Democrats and the Republicans now. The Democrats are having a bitter fight over their future, and the Republicans, well, they're almost having a civil war right now within the Republican Party. Because part of the thing about only two parties, with winner take all, there'll be a lot of different points of view. This is his point of view. You like his tie? Every time I see that picture, I just start laughing. It was so funny. So, here's Jefferson's America. Right here, the green and blue, heavily, pretty dense for citizens of the United States. A blotch here, then green, low density. And Jefferson was worried, as a lot of people in the United States, that these areas would break away and form their own country. And remember, Jefferson wanted here, not only because he's a farmer, but also who's going to move here? Yeah, the Eastern tribes here. That was his plan. But first, he needs this river. To move goods to market from the brand new city at the time, Cincinnati, to New York, it was faster to go down the Ohio, Mississippi, and around than go over the mountains. That's how bad the roads were. You know, before the National Road was built. So he needs New Orleans. So Jefferson began to figure out a way, finesse the Constitution to buy New Orleans. And what came out of it? The Louisiana Purchase. Who's that guy?
Napoleon.
That's a young Napoleon. And actually, he doesn't look that much like a junior high girl. It's very awkward for paintings at that time. Napoleon actually was quite, I guess he really was quite the dashing figure, but years of campaigning and war, and also being an emperor with the food and wine they had, he looked a little different at the end. No, he was not short. All right. That's British propaganda.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Don't think
He
I
was
saw
average
my
size.
7.
He was average. Yeah. The British wanted to make him, the British were trying to criticize him, make him look, say he was short. So the Napoleonic complex or that kind of thing. And, yeah, no, that's all just. Poor Napoleon. No. That's New Orleans route came out of the United States. And I'll tell you this story in just a second. But surprising everybody, they got the whole thing. It actually shocked them. Jefferson sent 2 trade representatives, Robert Livingston and James Monroe. And really the only one we need to know is James Monroe. Oh, we'll jump right here. Monroe would eventually become president, but they were told by New Orleans. By New Orleans. Do you remember Talleyrand, the guy in the XYZ affair? Still there. Talleyrand said, New Orleans, huh? We're not going to sell you New Orleans. We're going to sell you all, where's my mouse? Stay. All of Louisiana. For $15 million for 3 cents an acre. Now, it's almost impossible to put 15 million in 1803 for 15 million today, or what it would be like. You know, we're talking hundreds of billions of dollars. Because this is still pre-capitalism. The French, in a secret treaty, got this land back from Spain. In fact, nobody except a few people knew that. In St. Louis and New Orleans, they still had Spanish governments. They still thought they were under control of Spain. So, Livingston and Monroe were told, we'll sell you the whole thing. They didn't have authorization. And they knew the constitutional prices. So what did they say when Talleyrand offered the whole thing? Okay. Yes. Okay, good. Sounds good to me. They'll figure we'll let Jefferson deal with it later. And they signed right now because they knew Napoleon might change his mind. And actually, they literally got in a carriage as quick as they could and went to the coast, got on a boat, and took off. And Napoleon did change his mind. But they'd already signed it, it was too late. And then they got back to Jefferson. Before we get that, why would Napoleon, who wanted this land back in a treaty in 1801, sell it back? Yeah.
Because he's running out of money to pay for food and supplies for his army.
So he was having an issue, even though they weren't technically at war yet with the British, they knew it was going to happen. But that's not even that's a big reason, but there's even a bigger reason. Yeah.
They're so far away from.
Part of it.
Did he guess he's going to take it back eventually, like war with the U.S.?
Yeah. It's too big of an ocean. Figured the British be in the way. Even though those are good ideas, at the time it would have been almost impossible. The issue was he planned on a North American empire. He planned on getting back Sugar Islands here, growing wheat here to feed the slaves, and then eventually colonizing it. But first, he had to get back a colony. One of those islands he got back in that Treaty of Paris of 1763. Haiti. It was called Santo Domingo there, and they had a slave rebellion in 1791. Ironically, inspired by the French Revolution, they revolted against the Spanish. Now, their leader was, I mispronounced this, as an American speaker. I see this as Toussaint Overture. But I know Toussaint, it's I can speak a little bit of French. When I was in France, my wife could speak a lot of things. I just followed. But he was the leader of this rebellion. We're not going to go into the details of it, but they actually won their independence. Britain helped them. I think you can see why Britain was fighting the French. But not only that, the United States even recognized them, the Adams administration. But in 1801, Napoleon won in the back. And the French would send 15,000 crack troops to get this colony back. And what did Jefferson do in 1801 when the French were coming over? Jefferson helped the French. Okay, Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence. But before that, what is he? And what's his slave owner's biggest fear?
Rebellion.
So that's what he feared. And so ironically, Jefferson would try to help the French, which would have hurt him getting Louisiana. But the French had a devil of a time here, and then what disease just ravaged them? Malaria a little bit, there's another one. Huh? A little bit, but not West Nile. Yellow fever. Yellow fever just decimated his army. And in 1803, Napoleon realized it ain't going to happen. He actually abandoned his soldiers. Napoleon was good at that. He did the same thing in Egypt. And literally, right when he decided we can't get Haiti, guess who arrived? Livingston and Monroe. Right then. Perfect timing. Yeah, it was that close. Just pure luck. Because Napoleon said, no, wait a second, maybe I do want that. And who knows, and within a year, Napoleon is going to be fighting the Austrians and the Prussians and the Russians and the French. I mean, no, Europe. Yeah, he's going to fight Europe. So I have a little bit left to finish tomorrow. I'll finish a couple things. We'll bring out the musket. I will tell you about the duel tomorrow. Sound good?
Finally. Wait, we're missing the musket?
No, you're going to be here.
Oh.
Right, we come back.
The other period's going to miss.
I don't even know
What are you talking about?
no.
What? No, the other class, no, they're going to take the PSAT. But you guys are all going to be back.
I thought today was Monday.
See, so you get a day. And isn't it awesome that 2 Mondays in a week? It's so lucky.
No. Right.
All right, clear out, people.
Go to school on Sunday.
Yeah, Grace, don't cause trouble. Dylan, just it's people like you.
Oh.
I think you gotta eat out now.
Okay.
What day is it today? Yes, that's exactly the date. It's October.
Mark described a pudding egg style. Hey, stop talking bad about my leader.
All right, let's get to work.
Stop.
Would it be awesome if we had a test this week?
No, we're going to test today.
All right, clear your desk.
I'm ready.
My lunch pack.
Trust me, I got real nervous because I had posted. See?
Yeah, I'm the only one in the fly. All right, people.
The test is quoting platoon.
The test will be tomorrow. Lane's so ready to take off. We need a catalyst. Just to launch it.
He's got custom. You can't.
Yeah, where's the lane? Your legacy goes on.
I do take it. You know what, the eyes are funny.
Yes, they are. Really common.
No, wasn't it the Fridays or the senior prom? This way, guy. Yeah, that was the price I was willing to pay, Jay. Okay, would you like to know what's going to be on the test?
Yes.
Everything.
All the human histories.
Oh yeah, Sarah's still in Georgia.
Jordan, Montana or Georgia?
Yes. I don't like saying that she's in Jordan though, because all of you they get so envious. Where can I go to Jordan?